When fatal syndromes are born from incest, the consequences do not merely linger, they fester, transcending generations to devastate entire bloodlines. Nowhere did this grim truth cast a longer, more suffocating shadow than in the isolated, mist-shrouded mountains of eastern Kentucky. There, the harrowing history of the Harland family festered in the dark, buried for decades until it was violently ripped into the light in 1967. The Appalachian hills, with their dense, encroaching forests and deep, shadowed valleys, served as a perfect, silent prison for communities that sought to sever themselves from the judging eyes of society. Upon these steep, forbidding slopes, approximately 50 kilometers from the nearest whisper of civilization, the Harland family had entrenched itself. Their lineage was a gnarled tree, its roots sunk deep to the first European settlers of the 18th century. It was Dr. Robert Caldwell, a rural physician who served Kentucky's most forgotten communities, who first laid bare the nightmare. In his own words, etched with a shaking hand into his medical diary, "Never in my 35 years of medicine have I witnessed such a concentrated horror of congenital anomalies within a single family. The Harlands seemed to carry the cursed weight of generations fusing upon itself. Their property was a fortress of isolation, accessible only by a single, treacherous dirt road that clawed its way up the mountainside. Visitors were not merely rare, they were intruders in a sealed world. When Dr. Caldwell first answered an urgent call about a child struggling for breath, he was utterly unprepared for the descent into genetic purgatory that awaited him. The main house was a two-story structure of worn, weeping wood, surrounded by smaller huts scattered like tombstones across the land. In total, 32 souls were trapped within this familial compound. The patriarch, Jacob Harland, 68 years old in 1967, wore a permanently severe expression, a mask of iron-willed authority. His wife, Margaret, was also his first cousin, a union that was merely the prelude to the true symphony of suffering. It was the third generation that revealed the full, monstrous impact of their insular breeding. Of Jacob and Margaret's 9 children, 7 had taken their own cousins as spouses. From these unions slithered 23 children, 17 of whom were shackled with severe developmental curses. Dr. Caldwell's trained eye immediately saw the hallmarks of a biological collapse: prominent, distorted jaws, eyes set unnervingly close, fingers fused together as if by some terrible heat, and, in countless cases, a profound intellectual void. The most grievous case was Timothy, a 12-year-old boy imprisoned by a Pert syndrome, a rare condition that warps the skull and fuses the fingers. He was the product of 2 first cousins, Samuel and Ruth Harland, and he lived in constant agony, his brain compressed by the premature fusion of his own skull bones. The geographical isolation was merely the first layer of their tomb. With each passing generation, the social isolation had become an absolute, airless reality. Jacob Harland ruled his clan with a fist of iron, systematically extinguishing any desire for contact with the world beyond their trees. Children were never sent to school. Modern medicine was viewed as a poisonous heresy. Marriages were meticulously arranged within the ever-tightening family circle. "We preserve our lineage," Jacob had told Dr. Caldwell, his voice dripping with a fanatic's pride. Pure blood, without the contamination of the outside world. The doctor knew then he was not just examining patients, he was documenting the inhabitants of a sinking ship, captained by a madman. What began as a medical curiosity soon festered into a full-blown investigation. Local authorities, their hands forced by Dr. Caldwell's damning preliminary report, began to ask uncomfortable questions about medical neglect and stolen educations. In June of 1967, social workers, accompanied by the local sheriff, descended upon the property. What they uncovered was described in official reports as medieval. Children bearing the most severe deformities were kept in separate rooms, some tethered to their beds like animals to prevent them from harming themselves. There were no medical records. Several children had never even been granted the basic dignity of a birth certificate. The case erupted into public view. The Louisville Courier-Journal published a cover story titled "The Forgotten Family of the Mountains," which, while avoiding sensationalism, could not hide the gut-wrenching severity of the situation. The Harlands were forgotten no more. They were now a spectacle, a cautionary tale written in broken genes. But the true horror of the Harland lineage did not begin in 1967. To understand how a family can willingly walk into such genetic damnation, one must travel back to the late 18th century, to the first Harland who sought refuge in these very hills. Ezekiel Harland, a Scottish-Irish immigrant, established himself here around 1795, fleeing what he called the corruption of the eastern cities. He purchased 200 acres of unforgiving land, built a log cabin, and began his dynasty far from the eyes of a society he despised. Crucially, he married his own first cousin, Hannah, importing a cultural poison that would course through the family's veins for generations. In the isolated communities of the 18th and early 19th centuries, such unions were not just accepted, they were often encouraged to keep property and bloodline pure. This isolation was then brutally cemented by the American Civil War. While Kentucky remained with the Union, the Harlands, steeped in a deep distrust of any government, retreated further into their mountain fastness. The diaries of Josiah Harland, Ezekiel's great-grandson, offer a chilling glimpse into the family's metastasizing mindset. In an entry from 1863, he scrawled, "The world outside is shattering in war and madness. Here in the mountains, we preserve our way of life, our lineage, our traditions. We are the last guardians of the true American spirit." This rhetoric of purity and separation became their religion, a creed of isolation. With each generation, the isolation ceased to be a mere choice and became a fanatical ideology. Children were fed a steady diet of fear, taught that the outside world was a corrupting plague and that their survival depended on their union, literally. By the 1880 census, 18 Harlands lived on the expanded 320-acre property, 15 shared the same surname, a telling statistic of the incestuous web they were weaving. The census coldly notes 3 children as disabled, a sterile term for the beginning of the suffering to come. The turn of the century brought waves of change to America, but the Harlands deliberately let them break against their mountain. They refused electricity, preferring the flickering, uncertain light of kerosene lamps. Without radios or newspapers, they remained blissfully, tragically ignorant of the world's transformations, the Great Depression, the World Wars, all of it barely a whisper in their closed universe. It was in the 1930s that Jacob Harland, the patriarch Dr. Caldwell would meet, seized the family's reins and tightened them into a stranglehold. Under his rule, the practice of intra-family marriage became an unbreakable law. Local church records show he formally severed his family from the Baptist congregation in 1935 after a sermon spoke against the very unions that defined them. Jacob then crafted his own twisted religion, a homespun theology built on selective Bible readings and family law, which painted the Harlands as a chosen people, their purity a divine mandate against a fallen world. This isolation became so absolute that during the polio vaccination campaigns of the 1950s, health officials didn't even know many of the Harland children existed. It was only after the 1967 intervention that records revealed at least 2 children had died of polio, a disease that had been preventable for years. Their deaths were not acts of God, they were the direct result of a chosen ignorance. By the 1960s, the stage was set for a final, biological reckoning. The isolation was no longer just cultural or geographical, it had been carved into their very DNA. When Dr. Caldwell began his systematic documentation in 1967, he was charting the map of a genetic catastrophe. His records, preserved at the University of Kentucky, would become one of medicine's most chilling case studies on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. As one geneticist, Dr. Elena Simmons, would later state, "What we observed in the Harland family is the cumulative result of generations of genetic narcissism. It is like watching centuries of compressed genetic decay in just a few generations. The science is terrifyingly simple. Each person carries 2 copies of every gene. Many defective genes are recessive, their horrors only unleashed when a child inherits 2 copies, one from each parent. In a diverse population, This is rare. But when close relatives procreate, the probability skyrockets. First cousins share 12.5% of their genes. When this pattern repeats for generations, the result is a concentration of deleterious genes, a gathering storm of suffering that finally breaks over the children. Dr. Caldwell's documentation was a litany of rare genetic tortures. Beyond Timothy's Apert syndrome, he found polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, in 6 children. Syndactyly, fused fingers, in 4 children. Retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative blindness, in 3 teenagers. Cleft palates in 5 children. Varying degrees of intellectual disability in 14 children. Most haunting were the identical twins, James and John, born in 1955. Both were afflicted with a rare, disproportionate dwarfism, a condition so rare its spontaneous occurrence in a normal population is virtually impossible. They were living proof of the recessive curse that had taken hold. The impact was not limited to the visible. The family suffered from congenital heart disease, kidney failures, and rare metabolic disorders. Their average life expectancy was a meager 47 years for men and 51 for women, while the rest of America lived past 70. Perhaps most damning were the unofficial birth records. Of 49 pregnancies between 1945 and 1967, 14 ended in miscarriage, 7 in stillbirth, and 3 in neonatal death, a gestational loss rate 3 times the national average. Imagine the silent, desperate grief of these women, losing child after child, told it was God's will, never knowing the true, preventable cause festering in their own blood. The scientific term is inbreeding depression, the reduction of a population's fitness due to the accumulation of harmful genetic traits. In her definitive 1973 report, Dr. Simmons wrote, "The Harlands represent an involuntary natural experiment on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. The genetic consequences offer undeniable evidence of the biological risks of a family turning in upon itself, generation after generation." For the Harlands, these were not abstract statistics. Elizabeth Harland, one of the few who cooperated, told Dr. Caldwell, "We always knew we were different. The way people in town stared. Jacob said it was because we were special, chosen. I only realized later it was because we were sick." The discovery in 1967 triggered a legal and ethical earthquake. The case escalated from a medical concern to a fierce battle over child welfare, religious freedom, and the state's right to intervene. In July, the Kentucky Children's Services Department obtained a court order to examine all minors. Jacob's resistance was fierce. "No one will take my grandchildren," he roared at the sheriff. "God gave us these children." The operation to remove the children required a contingent of state police. Witnesses described scenes of sheer terror as frightened children, many of whom had never left their property, were wrenched from their parents. At the hospital, doctors confirmed Caldwell's worst fears and discovered new horrors. Timothy underwent immediate brain surgery. 3 others needed heart operations. The subsequent custody hearing was a landmark battle. The family's lawyer argued they were a private religious community being persecuted. But the evidence of genetic damage and neglect was overwhelming. Judge William Harrison's ruling established a formidable precedent. The right to religious belief is not absolute when it endangers the physical and mental well-being of children. He placed 17 of the 23 children under temporary state custody. The decision shattered the Harland world. Jacob, his authority broken, suffered a stroke and died just weeks later. The children, flung into a world they had been taught to fear, faced immense trauma. Social workers documented extreme anxiety and developmental delays. Siblings were separated, leading to regressive behaviors. For some, like 16-year-old Elizabeth, it was a terrifying but liberating awakening. She later wrote in her diary, "Everything is scary and strange. But for the first time, I'm learning things Jacob would never allow. Yesterday, a nurse explained why so many babies in our family die. It's not God's punishment." Nearly 6 decades later, the Harland legacy endures as a grim lesson. Their story is a microcosm of the eternal tension between tradition and progress, between the right to be left alone and the responsibility to protect the innocent. It is a powerful, threatening reminder that ignorance, when allowed to fester in the dark, becomes a generational curse. But it is also a story of resilience. Some descendants, like Sarah Harland, who became a social worker helping isolated communities, have dedicated their lives to ensuring other families need not suffer the same fate. In the end, Sarah once said, "My family's true tragedy was not the genes we shared, but the information we were denied. Knowledge would have been our salvation." The Harland case stands as a monument to a simple, terrifying truth, that the chains of tradition can become the bars of a prison, and that the silence of isolation is often broken only by the screams of the suffering born within it. It is a call to ensure that life-saving knowledge reaches every corner, no matter how dark or remote, lest we allow more families to be consumed by the very shadows they sought for refuge.